I think I can now introduce Angelo. After last week's presentation, when we had also a relatively young scholar, Anirvan, I'm so happy to introduce another rising star of this field, and that is Angelo Vito Panaro, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität, where he collaborates with the Varieties of Democracy Institute. I think many of us use V-Dem's database as the most valuable source for measuring democracy. So it's really great that Angelo is working with them. He's also the coordinator of the Italian Political Science Standing Group, Political Regimes. And in 2022, he was awarded the Carlo Maria Santoro Prize for the best paper presented by an early career researcher at the Italian Political Science Conference. His research focuses on the dynamics of regime change, social policy, and welfare state reforms, and also socio-economic inequality in authoritarian regimes. So, Angelo, the floor is yours. And anyone who would have questions or comments, please raise your hand. I will be watching, and then we give you the floor. And Angelo, I guess you will stop at certain points of your talk to look around for questions and comments.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dorothea, for the nice words. So I'm very happy to be here today, to be honest, because first of all, because I really enjoyed also attending the other sessions of the seminar, and I really feel like that my work talks to many of the work that were presented in the seminar. In addition to that, of course, having the possibility to present my research and receive feedback and comments is always wonderful. So I'm really happy to have the chance to present this work today. So as you can see, the work that I'm going to present today is titled "If Democracy Fails, Can Autocracy Succeed?" And I have to be honest, this title actually came out because of the recent discussions about the democracy failing to deliver, whereas autocracy succeeding and delivering social economic outcomes. So as I said before, this is a work in progress. So any comments, feedbacks are very much welcome. And I will try to have some interactions as well. So if you have any questions or if something isn't clear, please just let me know. The slide is not moving. Okay, yeah, no, it's moving. So the structure of the presentation says basically along 6 different lines. I will start with the general introductions on the overall state of democracy worldwide, and I will also introduce a little bit the reflections on autocratizations, because I think first of all, the discussions on autocratizations is in all our works and is actually quite at the center of the political debate. So I think it's also important to address how I phrase autocratizations based on previous studies and what I mean by autocratizations. There has been a lot of proliferations of theoretical discussions and concepts on autocratizations and democratic backsliding over the last 25 years. And so I want to just give an overview of what I intend for autocratizations and how I use it as a background for this research. Then I will introduce some discussions on the political regimes and social performance, building on previous studies that reflects on the importance of democracy, including democratic institutions, norms, and values, and their effect on social policy programs. I will then introduce my theoretical expectations based on previous studies and some descriptive evidence, and provide the empirical evidence first on the importance of democratic institutions and liberal norms and values on a set of social policy indicators, and then introduce more detailed discussions on the legitimation strategies and more specifically on performance-based legitimation strategies, and the role of this type of strategy in influencing different dimensions of social policy. As I said before, this is a work in progress, and so the conclusions are preliminary based on the evidence I have. But I really think that there is some kind of there are some interesting results that I'll be happy to talk and discuss with you more in detail. Yeah, let's start with the general overview of the state of democracy. I think also in the previous presentations that has been a lot of discussions on where are we and why what is the state of democracy worldwide. I would say that there are more very pessimistic perspectives in general. There are more optimistic perspectives. Like today, I was also today and yesterday I was also reading a little bit more the Economist report on the state of democracy, and I think the report is a little bit more positive compared to the Varieties of Democracy report, where there is a much more pessimistic perspective. Without going very much into details on the methodology and discussions on the different types of indicators, we can say that nowadays the world is, let's say, more democratic than it used to be, at least in 1978, 80s. In this figure, as you all know, you can see the Electoral Democracy Index, one of the most widespread indices used to measure the state of democracy from the Varieties of Democracy datasets 2026, so which was released less than 1 month ago. Countries in dark blue are, of course, countries that are more democratic, countries in dark red, countries that are less democratic. So in general, what we see is that the level of democracy is quite low in Asia and in Africa, whereas tends to be a bit better, or at least higher in Europe, Latin America, Oceania, and North America, which of course, this is just a picture on the state of democracy. It does not reflect the process of regime change. So as a general perspective, we can see that the state of democracy is a bit lower in certain areas compared to, like Latin America, North America, Western Europe, and Oceania. But I think the report from the Varieties of Democracy also goes a little bit more in details and shows that overall the level of democracy has decreased over the last 50 years, and nowadays more and more people are actually affected by the so-called process of autocratizations. There has been, as I mentioned before, over the last 25 years, the debate over autocratizations has exploded. So there has been a lot of discussions on the definitions of autocratizations, on the mechanisms and modes of autocratizations, on the actors and drivers of autocratizations, as well as the processes of resistance and reverse to the process of autocratization, so mostly democratic resilience. What I think is particularly important for me when talking about autocratizations, especially in my research, is definitely how we can, how can we identify autocratization? So which factors lead to the definitions of autocratizations, and which factors and actors can push towards the process of autocratizations. I think one of the most influential books is the one by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, and published in 2018, where the two professors basically identify the indicators, the major indicators of democratic erosions and norm breaking mostly in Western countries, with a strong focus on America, on the United States, but also in other countries. And they highlight that nowadays contemporary would-be autocrats tend very much to, build their political support on a set of strategies. For example, undermining electoral competitions, supporting or tolerate political violence, or supporting the curtailment of civil liberties, including media freedom and academic freedom as well as delegitimizing opposition leaders. So trying to personally attack opposition leaders in order to delegitimize their presence in the political competition. Another book which I think is also very important is the book by Anne Appelbaum, which was published in 2024. And I think this book is quite interesting because it shows that contemporary dictators do not live alone. So they're not isolated cases, but they tend to cooperate among themselves transnationally, creating networks of corruptions, propaganda, and also regime support. So I think this book is very important because, as I said before, contemporary would-be autocrats do not work in isolations. But in some cases, they tend to replicate similar strategies that has been used in other contexts, and in some cases, in most cases, they also tend to strengthen their position in power by collaborating or reinforcing collaborations and networks with other dictators or would-be autocrats. Nowadays, this is quite clear if we think about the case of the United States and some other countries, for example, Argentina or Italy. We can see that there is a very strong networks among certain countries. Then finally, I would say like a more general encompassing approach to autocratizations is the Routledge book on autocratizations by Aurel Crossan and Luca Tomini, which was published in 2024. And I think this book is actually delving very much into, the processes, the drivers, and the institutional dynamics of autocratizations and comparative perspective. So it's a more comprehensive approach to different dimensions and discussions on autocratizations, including also different ways through which we can measure autocratizations. So, but as I said before, since 2000, the literature on autocratizations has exploded. So nowadays, what I feel is that there is a lot of debate about the different ways for which autocratizations can be classified or defined. And in some cases, some concept might also overlap among each other. So just want to be sure, just want to be clear of what I mean by autocratizations as a process of regime transitions away from the general definitions of liberal democracy or DL definition of liberal democracy. So there are three main components for which I define a process of autocratizations. The first one is that autocratizations is a process. So it entails the deteriorations of democratic norms, institutions, and values. And it does not reflect the state of democracy in a country, but it's more like a process. So it's more like a temporal evolutions of the decline of certain aspects of democracy. The second important thing is that autocratizations can take place in any type of regime. So it can start in liberal democracy as well in electoral autocracies. Does not matter where autocratization starts because it's a kind of an umbrella concept that entails any type of regime transformations towards less democratic regimes. And then finally, it does not really take into account the ending point. So the process of autocratizations can end into a less democratic regimes, meaning an electoral autocracies, an electoral democracy, or a closed autocracy. So in general terms, what the first studies on autocratizations were actually talking about is that we should consider autocratizations as the opposite of the process of democratizations. Just a brief note on this. While for many years we actually focus on the difference between democracy and autocracy, over the last 10, 15 years, there has been a lot of studies focusing also on the gray zone. So the countries that are very difficult to basically divide between different types of democracies and different types of autocracy. And some scholars call them competitive electoral autocracies. Some others talk more about hybrid regimes, and some others just identify this as a kind of gray zone. And this gray zone includes countries that might have certain aspects of democracy, for example, military elections multi-party elections that are free and fair, but they might miss some key aspects of electoral democracy, for example, the respect of freedom of associations or freedom of expressions. And there are many cases, for example, the first one that comes to my mind is the case of Georgia, which does not really fit in either of the two categories, so electoral democracy or electoral autocracies. There are some scholars that actually talk about a different process of regime transformations as a process of hybridization. So as a process where countries are actually becoming much more hybrid rather than simply shifting towards less democratic dimensions. What is also important for me is that there are different types of autocratization. So when we compare autocratizations processes across different countries, we also have to keep in mind that these processes might take place differently. And we can also use like kind of different terms and different approaches. So while autocratizations is an umbrella concept, the way I see autocratizations and along with some other scholars is that it can be broken down along three different types of autocratization. So when we have a shift from liberal democracy to electoral democracy, then this process is more kind of democratic erosions. When we actually have a regime break, so from democracy to autocracy, we talk about democratic breakdown. And then when we basically see the deteriorations of democratic attributes within authoritarian regimes, we can call this as a process of declining autocracies or authoritarian consolidations. But what is very important for me is that autocratizations remains an umbrella concept that is used to kind of include all the different types of processes of deteriorations of democratic norms and attributes. So against these definitions, very recently, like there has been, as I said before, the discussions on where are we? So what is the current trends of autocratizations and democratizations in the world? And in the V-Dem report, which is, as I said before, was published only 1 month ago, there are some kind of important nuances. So in this picture, you can actually see on the left side the number of countries that has experienced autocratizations and democratizations, whereas on the right side you can see the share of the population that has been affected by the share of autocratizations and democratization. So what we can see here is that in 2025. Around 44 countries have actually experienced a process of autocratization. So the decline of the quality of democracy has been identified in 44 countries worldwide, and this basically affects 41% of the world population. These numbers are quite high when we consider that, the process, the so-called third wave of autocratizations, has already started in 1992, and these numbers have reached over the last 2 years quite impressive levels. Of the 44 autocratizing countries, 28 were in fact democracies. The most clear one is the case of the United States, and of these 28 countries, 13 remain democracies in 2025. So let's say that more countries are actually experiencing this regime transitions from democracy to autocracies, not only the deteriorations of democratic attributes, but also kind of the breakdown of democracy, so the real transitions towards more authoritarian regimes. What is very scary, I think, is that this sign of autocratizations continue and is kind of cresting, especially over the last 2 years, but we don't see a slowing process. So we don't see any, reductions in this process, although there have been some countries that managed to return to previous democratic levels, for example, the case of Poland. But in most of the countries that have experienced a process of autocratizations, this process continues, so it's still ongoing. And this is a kind of worrying pattern. So this is quite important because I think the research that I'm actually conducting talks very much to this background. So we have to keep in mind that nowadays we live in a world where more and more countries are shifting towards less democratic regimes. And this is particularly important because this raises important questions for social policy scholars, which are, I think we can address all together. So the first one, is that we should actually go back, I think, to the classic studies where we were looking at comparing political regimes and social policy programs, and ask ourselves whether democracy continue to perform better than autocracies in delivering social benefits and outcomes, whether in this world where more and more countries are actually moving towards less democratic regimes, democracy continue to hold and continue to basically deliver more social benefits and outcomes compared to autocracies. The second key questions that I think still remains open is that if this is not the case, so if there are some democracies that do not perform better than autocracies, and of course there is some evidence about this, then the question is like why some democracy actually fall short while others succeed. So what makes some democracies successful while others not? Once again, having in mind the current political context. And then finally is, what about authoritarian regimes? So under what conditions authoritarian regimes can in fact deliver more than democracies? So what conditions facilitate autocracies to deliver social benefits and outcomes more effectively than democracies? As I said before, some of these questions have already been answered in previous studies, but I think when we keep in mind the current dynamics of autocratizations, these questions are really they require really very deep investigations. So to answer these questions, I go back to previous literatures on political regimes and social performance and more generally social policy programs. And basically, as you all know, the literature is quite vast. So I do not attempt to cover all the literature in half an hour, but I want to pick up on the major studies, major theories and approaches that could explain regime types and social policy programs in order to basically build on them and then elaborate some more recent, or let's say more kind of appropriate hypothesis to test this relationship. So as you all know, the first theories on regime types and social policy are the so-called functionalist theories, according to which, the process, the logic of modernizations, urbanizations, and economic growth has increased the likelihood that democracy and its capacity to deliver social goods. And these functionalist theories have been quite strong, especially in the 70s and 80s, to explain why democracies have actually outperformed autocracies in terms of their ability to deliver social goods. Of course, like when looking at the history of the welfare state and social policy, we all know that the first types of the emergence of the welfare state was actually related to better or economic conditions linking to different type of logic, such as the logic of modernizations or economic growth or urbanization. More recently, of course, there is an important caveat because structurally functionalist theories have been criticized in many approaches, but one of the major caveat is, of course, the rentier state theory, which argues that it's not just economic growth or economic modernizations which can explain why certain democracies perform better than autocracies in delivering social goods. But in some cases, certain authoritarian regimes may also promote the delivery of social goods, and particularly those countries are the ones that have higher levels of productions and export of natural resources. So Michael Ross called this the social spending effect of the production and export of natural resources. Over the last years, of course, institutionalist and neo-institutionalist approaches have emerged, shedding lights on the role, particularly of formal and informal democratic institutions in explaining social policy transformations. And the very common one is, of course, the extensions of the franchisee, which builds on the very well-known model by Meltzer and Richard in 1981, but also the presence of free, fair, and competitive elections, which has received a lot of attention from different scholars, from different backgrounds, and from different geographical areas, ranging from Latin America to Sub-Saharan Africa to East Asia. And then since 2005, 2008, there has been what Pepinski called this kind of institutionalist turn, which very much focus on the rule of legislations and and electoral competitions to explain the different types of social policy reforms in also comparing democracy and autocracies. And the most important studies is the book by Jennifer Gandhi, which was published in 2008. In addition to this one, we also have the liberal perspective. So it's not just, structural factors or the presence of formal or informal institutions, but also the respect of certain liberal dimensions, including property rights, civil liberties, and political rights, which play a role in explaining why democracies tend to outperform autocracies in terms of social policy, social problems and policy outcomes. So this is, as I mentioned before, it doesn't aim to be exhaustive, but I think it gives like a general overview of what were, kind of the major approaches in previous studies on regime types and social policy. But more recently, especially when having in mind the autocratizations process and the third wave of autocratizations in which we are living in, there has been, new discussions on the fact that democracy is not able to deliver anymore. So what these theories were very much working in a context where democracy was seen as the only game in town, nowadays where democracy is not anymore the only game in town, then there has been more discussions about the whether democracy and not delivering the arguments is actually holding. I think one of the most influential studies is the work by Carothers and Hartnett, which was published in 2024. They start from the assumptions that the current support for democratic backsliding or would-be autocrats is mostly caused by the fact that democracies nowadays fail to deliver socio-economic goods. And they run a bunch of statistical analysis based on 12 cases, and they find that the poor socioeconomic performance of authoritarian regimes is neither necessary nor sufficient to explain the backsliding in most cases. So it's not democracy failing to deliver that explain the current trends of autocratizations, because in many cases this was not there. And they mentioned, for example, the case of India, which has actually experienced a shift towards less democratic regimes. So nowadays is classified as an electoral autocracy according to the V-Dem, which actually started the process of autocratizations when was increasing, when was the economic growth, during periods of economic growth. And there are also other cases, for example, Bangladesh, or also the case of Italy. So they conclude that democracy erodes mainly because democracies fail to constraints, not because they fail to produce socioeconomic goods, but mostly because they miss this kind of institutional safeguards that protect democratic institutions, norms, and values from predatory power ambitions, so from contemporary would-be autocrats. Of course, this study has raised a lot of discussions, and more importantly, I think the response by Fukuyama and Magaloni in 2025 has addressed partly this debate. So the two scholars actually focus on the citizens' perceptions of democratic performance, especially in delivering public goods and services that are considered to be central for democratic legitimacy and support. Actually, to be fair, they consider legitimacy as an essential characteristics of any type of political regimes, not only democracies. But what they find out is that the dissatisfactions with democracy ability to deliver that can undermine trust in democracy and therefore fuel support for authoritarian alternatives. So their arguments is that there is, kind of dissatisfactions of individuals with the ability of democracy to deliver. And this dissatisfaction as fuel supports for strong leaders or contemporary would-be autocrats. So they bring back this debate about the social contract idea that democracy should and must deliver tangible outcomes in order to increase citizen trust in democracy itself. If they fail to do so, then citizens lose, their faith and trust in democracy, and therefore they can easily turn towards different types of figures, such as would-be autocrats. So it is essential that democracies should maintain their accountability and therefore should deliver, and they should deliver more than what they're actually doing nowadays. Within the democracy not delivering debates, also the work by Maya Tudor basically focus on the try to assess the impact of democracies across a wide range of indicators, including health, education, peace, and economic performance. And her work basically shows that democracy, on average, continue to be associated with longer life expectancies, so kind of better health conditions, more educations, greater peace and sustained growth. However, there are some differences in equality and speed. For example, when looking at educations, she argues that if it's true that there is more access to educations, the quality of educations in democracies is not comparatively higher than the quality of educations in authoritarian regimes. And we can talk a lot about this, I think, given the current trends in the United States, in Italy, in Hungary, and Turkey, and so on. So I think we can also just develop like empirical research on this topic, on the quality of educations nowadays in contemporary, autocratizing countries. But in general, her work shows that democracies do deliver important social and developmental benefits, reinforcing mostly the normative case for democracy, even where performance debate persists. So the key message is that democracy continued to maintain its own advantage, and its institutional checks matters for the societal well-being, even although skepticism remains about democratic performance. So I think in our work, we can conclude at least that democracies tend to be associated with better socioeconomic outcomes. However, we should be careful because in some cases these outcomes can vary, for example, the quality of educations or the speed of economic growth. So within the democracy not delivering debate, we can basically sum up these discussions on the relationship between political regimes and social performances by saying that historically, building on previous studies, democracy were outperforming autocracies on a wide range of social policy indicators, including coverage of social protection programs, including social spending, including benefit levels, and so on. And this is mostly attributed to the fact that, democracies tend to promote and tend to have well-established democratic norms and institutions, which promote political participations, inclusions, and higher electoral competitions, as well as because they promote liberal values such as civil society participations and the respect of political and economic rights. There are some studies that also show that the legacy to democracy tend to be one of the key factors. So countries that have been for a longer time democratic then also tend to replicate and be more democratic and therefore more committed to higher levels of social economic outcomes. However, under certain conditions, recent studies shows that autocracy can outperform democracies in some social policy programs delivery. So nowadays, there are some conditions under which autocracies outperform democracies. And of course, I don't want to, say that this is a great result, but we should acknowledge that autocracies tend to outperform democracies nowadays. And this can be because autocracies have stronger state capacity. So they have more fiscal capacity, more administrative capacities, for example. And there are many examples from China that shows that China has a stronger state capacity than Italy, for example. It could be because of financial resources. Some authoritarian regimes, especially in the MENA regions, have more financial resources than well-established democracies, because of economic performance, or simply because of citizen supports and expectations for the leadership's performance. So given these results, I thought a lot about how to theorize, the current expectations based on the previous literature and the current trends of autocratizations. And I started by simply asking, is it true that nowadays, in the words of Autocratization's democracy continue to perform when we look more specifically on a set of social policy indicators? And my first hypothesis is that democracies are, on average, still expected to provide higher levels of welfare provisions than autocracies. So when we compare certain indicators, we can still believe and think that democracies are, on average, expected to provide higher levels of welfare provisions than autocracies. And this is mostly because, despite we live in a world that is autocratizing, democracies still have a bunch of indicators and dimensions that are particularly important for welfare state provisions. This includes the presence of formal and informal democratic institutions, something that Alperin calls as the democracy advantage arguments. So the presence of free, fair, and competitive elections nowadays continue to be an important dimension because it fosters political participations, inclusion of different interests in the political arena, and therefore more inclusive also policymaking process. The presence of legislations also foster debates and inclusions of different interests within the political arena. So this is mostly, let's say, the kind of supply side, so the rule of formal and informal institutions. But there is also the demand side that, political participations, public contestations, more space for civil society organizations, the inclusions of different interests, and the possibility to contest, social policy decisions remains a prerogative of democracies. And therefore, all these aspects continue nowadays to be particularly important when looking at welfare state provisions. However, democratic institutions are not necessarily the only thing that can explain why democracies can promote welfare provisions compared to autocracies. Since Leipzig, there has been a lot of debate about the role of legitimation strategies in both democratic and authoritarian regimes. And more recently, I think the attention on legitimation strategies has been mostly focused on authoritarian regimes. Showing that contemporary autocrats do not only live by repressing people, but they also very much live with different types of legitimation strategies. So they adopt a combination of different factors that you can call carrots and sticks, you can call legitimations, repressions, and cooptations, and so on. But the most important thing is that authoritarian regimes do not rely only on military interventions, but they might use a tool of indicators, different strategies that secure the position in power. In some cases, they also foster the process of autocratization. So the work by Janusz Gaszewski, for example, is particularly interesting because it shows that by employing a combination of three different core pillars, legitimations, cooptations, and repressions, authoritarian regimes manage to stay in power for a longer time compared to authoritarian regimes where they only rely on coercions and military repressions. Also in 2013, Stefan Keilitz was proposing different types of political regimes classifications, which builds on the different patterns of legitimation, so different ways through which autocrats, secure their position in power. And he basically argues that we do not only need to focus on the mechanism that allows different autocrats or rulers to get in power, but also the way through which they justify their position in power. So the narratives, for example, or the source of their legitimations. It can be from within the political arena, from outside of the political arena, from within the ruling coalitions, and so on. And we should take into account these variations when we basically also look at different regime types. So having these discussions in mind, my arguments basically builds on some previous work that I've conducted where I basically, was reflecting on the relationship between different dimensions of democracy and social spending. So in 2025, I basically studied I published the article on democratizations where I study whether, democratic institutions are enough to explain variations in social spending, so in public spending in health and education, or whether there is another dimensions, particularly legitimation strategies and political ideology that can explain these variations in social spending. And what I find out is that there is no effect of the Euro multi-party elections or the ruling coalition size on the level of public spending in health and education, But what is very important is the way through which autocrats legitimize their position in power, and in particular their political ideology, with left-wing ideology being associated with higher levels of both health and education spending. So in a recent work, in a recent book chapter that I'm actually working on, I go a little bit more in details and to test whether this is true also when looking at other social policy indicators, not only social spending, but also coverage of certain social policy programs. So overall, what I expect to see is that in my research is that, first of all, is that democracies tend to promote on average more welfare state provisions and social policy outcomes, but also the rule of legitimation strategies is particularly important, and we should take into account this when studying the effect of political regimes on social policy. To test this approaches, I basically use two measures of democracy, which includes the Electoral Democracy Index and the Liberal Democracy Index. As you all know, the Electoral Democracy Index builds on Dahl's definitions of polarity and mostly focus on the procedural aspects of democracy, whereas the Liberal Democracy Index is a bit more, let's say, more complex and starts from the procedural aspects of democracy, but also add the liberal components, including the rule of law, the separation of power, and the protections of civil liberties and political rights. Both indicators are sourced from the Varieties of Democracy datasets, which was published 1 month ago. And as you all know, we all use V-Dem data, so I will not go very much into details on how the V-Dem data is computed. But what I think is very important is that the V-Dem data is quite transparent in the methodology. And so this allows also for replications of studies and also for different types of estimation techniques when you use V-Dem data. So I think these are quite useful source for all of us when studying different dimensions of democracy, but also more generally social science concepts. When measuring social performance, I use a bunch of social policy indicators, which includes government expenditures in health, education, and social protections, social policy programs coverage, measured by the share of the population covered by 3 different types of social programs, so social insurance program, social protections, and social assistance programs. And then finally, I also look at the social outcomes that includes income distributions for the top 1% and top 10% of the populations, as well as the overall level of inequality measured by the Gini index. All this data are sourced from the IMF Financial Statistics and from the WDI, from the World Bank datasets. So the sample include 179 countries from 1975 to 2025. And my empirical analysis basically builds on both descriptive evidence and more, let's say, more general empirical strategy, which employs a set of static and dynamic models, including the ECM's models, to capture both short-term and long-term dynamics. So to see whether the effect of democracy might change if we look at the short-term or long-term dynamics with the dependent variables. So as I said before, the dependent variable include social policy indicators, whereas independent variables are both the ADI and LDI, as well as the extent of legitimation strategies, which are also sourced from the Varieties of Democracy indicators. Just want to point out that I run also some additional empirical evidence using different types of indicators for democracy, both sourced from the Varieties of Democracy datasets, but also from the Economist Intelligence Unit and Polity4. But I will not show this results today. So to test the first hypothesis, I run first some descriptive evidence, and what I actually find out, it's something quite interesting. So in this graph, you can see on the left column the relationship between Liberal Democracy Index and the 3 dimensions of government spending. So the first one is government spending in education, the second one is government expenditures in health, and the last one is government expenditures in social protections. The right column instead shows the same dependent variables, but using the electoral democracy index. As I said, the sample includes 179 countries from 1975 to 2025. And what we actually can see from just this descriptive evidence is that both indicators, so whether we use the LDI or EDI, we see that they are negatively associated with government spending and government spending on educations. But both indicators tend to be positively related to government expenditures in health and social protection. This is quite interesting. It is very much in line with previous studies, but is also interesting because the first questions that we that this descriptive evidence shows us that there might be some authoritarian regimes that invest very much in educations and that there are many reasons for that. But it's also interesting to see that there is not a straightforward relationship between the level of democracy and government expenditures in education. The second descriptive evidence builds on the extent of coverage for three different types of social policy programs. So the first one is social insurance programs, the second one is social protections and labor, and the last one is social safety nets. And in this case, we actually see that whether we use the liberal democracy index or the electoral democracy index, we see that the level of democracy is in all cases positively associated with the share of the populations covered by social policy programs. And this, as I said before, is confirmed whether we look at social insurance programs, social protections and labor programs, or social safety net programs. And then lastly, when looking at social outcomes, also in this case, the result is not particularly surprising because we see that the level of democracy is negatively associated with the lower levels of inequality, so lower levels of the income shares of the top 1%, top 10%, and general lower levels of inequality measures by the Gini index. But this descriptive analysis actually is partially confirmed in the empirical evidence. So when looking at the long-term effect of democracy on this 9 different indicators, we actually see some differences. So first of all, we see that democracy is positively influences social spending, particularly education and health, but there is not substantial evidence that democracy is actually promoting social protection expenditures, at least not in the long run. When we look at the short-run effects, we see that democracy is actually pushing towards social protections, but in the long run, this effect is not statistically significant. So basically suggesting that democracy is not considered, democratic regimes do not spend more than authoritarian regimes in social protection programs. What is also interesting is that the effects of democracy on inequality is much weaker than from the descriptive evidence, because we see that this results is not particularly significant, as the top income shares as well as the Gini index show only minor declines. And the Gini index is negatively and statistically significant in the short run, so suggesting that countries that the effect of democracy in the short runs on the overall levels of inequality is negative and statistically significant, but this effect dissipates after some years. What is very important is actually the extent of coverage for different types of programs. And here we see that there is a lot of, that the uncertainty levels are particularly high. So we cannot basically say anything conclusive about the extent of democracy on the social protections, social assistance, and social safety net coverage, because the uncertainty levels are particularly high. And this is mostly due to different, I think it's very much related to the data structures, because most of the data are actually coming from liberal democracies, and we don't see a lot of variations from coming from authoritarian regimes. So as you can see in this graph, the level of uncertainty is particularly high. So the results that relates to the coverage should be interpreted very carefully. What is very important now is that I also consider a different type of perspective. So if we see that democracy tend to have on average an effect on at least on the level of spending and on some dimensions of inequality, then the question is whether we can generalize these arguments according to different type of regime. So what happens when we adopt a regime type perspective? So what happens when we focus on closed autocracies, electoral autocracies, electoral democracies, and liberal democracy? What is the picture that we actually get there? And in this picture, is just a descriptive statistic of the distributions of the 9 different indicators across the 4 different groups of countries. So the regime types, so closed autocracies, electoral autocracies, electoral democracy, and liberal democracies. And here, the difference is a bit more nuanced. Maybe you can tell me what you see in this picture. I spent a lot of time looking at this picture and running different visualizations of this data, but I would be happy actually to hear what you can see, and you can tell me when looking at this picture. So dependent variables are actually the same as before. The level of government expenditures in 3 sectors, the extent of coverage, and the share of inequality measure has the Gini coefficients, the top 1% income share, and the top 10% income share.
Overall democracy do not matter that much? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean that's actually partly the picture that we see. If we go a little bit more in details and we see, we keep this regime type perspective, we can actually see that, for example, there isn't so much variations between electoral democracies and electoral autocracies in some dimensions. For example, when looking at education expenditures, we see that level of education expenditures in electoral autocracies, electoral democracies, and liberal democracies is not very much different. This also suggests that there might be something more that explain these variations. But in some cases, for example, Gini coefficients is particularly interesting because, we see that inequality is much higher in electoral democracies compared to the electoral autocracies. So if we stick to the institutionalist perspective, then we would expect the level of inequality in electoral democracies to be a bit lower than in electoral autocracies. But that's not the case. But there's also another interesting perspective here, which I think relates very much to the difference within the authoritarian regimes. Sorry. And in this case, for example, so in the case of health expenditures, we see that there is not so much difference between electoral autocracies and closed autocracies. But we also see that the coverage is it's a bit lower in case of electoral autocracies compared to closed autocracies when we look at social insurance and social safety net programs. And then finally, when looking at social outcomes, the top 1% income share in electoral autocracies is not very much different from the distributions of income for the top 1% in closed autocracies. So I think this picture itself already tells us that, first, democratic institutions might not be the only explanations when looking at different dimensions of social policy, and there might be something more that we need to dig deeper. And as I said,
Angelo, may I
yeah,
just suggest something? Because you have a very long time span, right? Like since 1975, right?
yeah, right,
So
yeah,
then you're actually covering all the socialist and all the socialist, the Soviet states, and also the um, state
yeah,
socialist countries, right?
yes,
That
right,
were obviously, more pro-equality
yeah,
than democracies back then.
exactly.
Despite the parallel development of welfare states, both in authoritarian socialist regimes and in capitalist democracies.
Yes, that's true. That's true. And I think also having this idea in mind, That's why I actually went into, like a different types of perspective, which is not necessarily, whether the countries is democratic or authoritarians, but there might be like, for example, different types of legitimation strategies, such as ideology or other dimensions that it can, shed lights on these differences more in details. So you're right, and actually run the same descriptive evidence focusing on 1990, 2025, so more recent period. And I still see some differences, not as pronounced as much as we see here. But still, I think the democratic institutional perspective is not enough to basically explain these variations. And so the second step that I take in my study is actually focusing on the different types of legitimation strategies that are used by, democratic and non-democratic leaders. And more specifically, performance-based ideology is very important. So the fact that some leaders, whether they are democratic or authoritarian, justify their position in power by saying that we are delivering better social economic outcomes. We are improving the quality of educations. We are improving the quality of health, or we are investing very much into economic growth. Then I think this kind of narratives and more specifically legitimation strategies helps us to see or shed lights a little bit more on the variations in the social performance of different regimes. And so when looking at the different descriptive evidence, here the story is a bit different. So in this graph, we see the extent of performance-based legitimation strategies used in both democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes, and their effect on health, education, and social protection expenditures. And the story is a bit different here. So we see that countries that basically built on performance-based ideology, they tend to be associated with higher levels of education expenditures, but they do not invest very much into health and social protections, at least when looking at this time span. So this is actually, as I said before, goes very much in line with previous studies that show that authoritarian regimes have interest in, investing into educations, for example, but also kind of contrast with the idea that authoritarian regimes invest into health spending or health sectors. When looking at the other dimensions, here I show the inequality levels, and the inequality is actually confirmed. So regimes that rely on performance-based ideology are all associated with higher levels of equality, so lower levels of inequality, whether we measure as the share of income for the top 1%, the top 10%, or the Gini index, so the overall level of inequality. So in a nutshell, I think, as I said before, I'm still running the empirical analysis for the performance-based ideology evidence. But what we can see from the preliminary evidence I have is that the relationship between democracy, or more generally political regimes, and social performance is quite complex and can not only rely on the presence of democratic institutions and norms, but there are other factors, particularly the performance-based ideology and the type of legitimation strategies that is used by the regime, by leaders that explain the different types of social performance of regimes. So in a nutshell, when we go to some preliminary conclusions, we can see that democracies are on average associated with better social performance. This is in general because democratic institutions and values tend to support higher level of social spending, with the exceptions of social protections. They tend to promote broader social policy programs coverage and lower levels of inequality only in the short terms, not in the long term. But when we look at the type of legitimation strategies that is used by leaders, then we can see that countries that rely on performance-based legitimation strategies tend to deliver high levels of education spending, not of health and social protections. They continue to promote broader social policy programs coverage, and also tend to deliver lower levels of inequality. So my first conclusions, my conclusion is that it's a combination of institutional incentives, so democratic institutions that can explain some variations between democracies and autocracies, but this is not the only explanations because, as I said before, and as we saw in the previous slides, there's still some differences within democracies and authoritarian regimes. And when focusing on political incentives and more specifically on the type of legitimation strategies, that we can have a better picture of why certain regime types tend to perform differently across the different social policy dimensions. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.